as James has done many times throughout this book, he takes a very straightforward approach in these first 3 verses to point out one of the reasons that these Christians were struggling to mature spiritually. And I think if you've lived the Christian life long, you find there reaches a point where you almost plateau or level off, where there's a lot of growth at first when you give your life to the Lord and you're excited about the things of the Lord, and there's a lot of growth, and then it seems that there can be a point where it kind of levels off a little bit, and some of the newness has worn off to our shame. The newness should never wear off, and God's grace is always something to be amazed with. But he's dealing with the people here about just their struggle to grow in their relationship with the Lord, but also, and even primarily in this text, in their relationship with other Christians. And so he deals with a few things in this. I want to give you a summary of the message, and then we'll get into it. I want you to notice real quickly a few areas. We notice in verse number 1, they were wrong in their relationships. If I could give a title to the message this morning, it would be this: Christians Who Don't Get Along. I know that probably shocks some people, that's even a possibility. But he's dealing with some Christians who are struggling to get along with one another. And we notice 3 ways that he identifies this. In verse 1, they were wrong in their relationships. You can look at verse 1, and he says there's wars and fightings among you. Not dealing with wars and fightings with the enemy, but among themselves. And he even says, even lust the war in your members, referring to even your own mind and your own body. There's this war that is taking place in relationships or regarding your relationship with other people. We notice in verse number 2, they were wrong in their methods. So their relationships are wrong, and then the way they are handling that is also wrong. In verse number 2, you lust and have not, ye kill and desire to have. Aren't you glad we don't have those church members? That's a blessing. You cannot obtain, ye fight and war, yet you have not because you ask not. So their relationships are wrong. Their response to the relationship, their method is also wrong. But then we also see in verse number 3 that their dependency is wrong. They are not depending upon the Lord, but rather they are dependent upon themselves. Ye ask not, ye ask amiss. You want to consume it upon your own lust or your own desires. In other words, your motives are purely selfish, and they do not think of others or just trust the will of God. And so they've got this issue going on among themselves within this church family. Their relationships are wrong. The way they are handling it is wrong. And who they are depending upon is wrong. How many would agree this is a recipe for disaster? I mean, this is the complete opposite of what God would desire out of his people and out of a church family and out of these relationships that he's given us. So let's look first of all this morning at their relationship. In verse number 1, he begins with a very thought-provoking question. I want you to look real closely at how he starts chapter 4. He starts with this question: from whence come wars and fightings among you? The question is this: what do you think is the source of all your disagreement? What do you think is at the heart of the fact that here we are, God's people, saved by the same blood of Jesus, serving the same God, wanting everything? I mean, our heart is for the things of God. We believe the same. We come, we read the Bible together. We sing the songs together. We're gathering together. We're assembling together. Why in the world would those people not get along one with another? And so he gives this thought-provoking question: where do you think this comes from? From whence come these wars and these fightings among you? Of course, in typical fashion, he doesn't give them a chance to answer, but rather he answers. So he gives this thought-provoking question, and we're serving God, yet we are not getting along. We're singing the same songs, yet we are not getting along. And I find it interesting that he does not ask why. Because I'll be truthful, that's my first question. Why do you not get along? Why are there fightings among you? Why are there disagreements among you? But Jesus goes a little bit deeper, or James does through the inspiration of the Spirit of God. He goes a little bit deeper and he says, I'm not worried about the why. He says, I want you to think about, where does that come from? Where does that spirit of disagreement and that discontentment with one with another, where does it come from? And the obvious answer is this: it does not come from God. This is not a moving of God in our congregation. This wouldn't be what people call revival. I mean, the disputings, the disagreements, the ill feelings one toward another, the critical thoughts one towards another, the blaming other people for things. This is not from the Spirit of God, and that's really what James wants them to see. Where do you think this comes from? Because two people don't have a disagreement and say unkind things and say, what a move of God. Aren't you glad we're serving God together? But rather, the opposite happens, doesn't it? When there's all the fighting and the disagreements, it actually makes you question whether you want to be in this thing or not. And so it creates an opposite reaction of really what godliness ought to create. A critical spirit towards somebody else is not God-given. God doesn't put that thought on your heart of how terrible of a person that is. These are things that come of our own selves. And so he asked them this, I believe anyway, a very thought-provoking question concerning the fightings among themselves. Well, then he answers with what I'm going to call a soul-searching question. You ever had somebody answer your question with a question? Isn't that annoying? I mean, it can be frustrating. Well, here James just goes ahead and beats him to it. He asked this thought-provoking question: where do you think these fightings and these wars, where do you think these come from? And then he follows it with really a question to make them search their own soul in verse number 1. Come they not hence even of your lust that war in your members? Is this not something that comes from within you? Again, giving the contrast, this is not something that comes from God. This is something that comes from the flesh of man. This is something that comes from our old nature. This is something that comes from our old man. And so these fightings, these negative attitudes toward others, these disagreements with others, and I feel like I need to stop and pause here because we have some visitors here. I thank God that I don't have to preach this message because there are problems. I'm glad that we can just cover this going through the book of James, but I also am not so naive enough to think that there aren't roots of this that are taking place everywhere. And so we see these negative attitudes towards others, these disagreements with the others, this bitterness and dissatisfaction with others. And I think we would all agree when he says these wars and fightings, we're not talking about just a mere disagreement. We're talking about it's a disagreement to the point that it influences my opinion of them. It influences my relationship with them. It influences their testimony to me. It gets deep down in me where it influences really how I feel about them as a person. He says it comes because of your own desires that war in your members. As you study out the New Testament, you'll find that word members refers to individuals in a church body. You'll find it refers to individual parts of a body. And here he's pointing out that the problems, the fighting, and all these things, they are not at the source of God, but rather they are at the source of self. And he even makes a few references to your own lust, your own desires. In other words, their disappointment began to bother them, and please don't miss this. Their disappointment and frustration began to bother them the most in their own mind. Have you ever had somebody do something that you just couldn't stop thinking about? I mean, we all have people do things that we don't agree with or we think could have done differently, and we're able to dismiss it. That's not my responsibility. That's not my job. Oh, well, no big deal. I might have done it different, but no harm done. But every now and then somebody will do something and it just eats away at our mind. It's not our responsibility. It's not our job. It's not our area. It doesn't even have anything to do with us. but yet we think so much that they did it wrong, or they said it wrong, or they handled it wrong, or something should have been done different, and it just stirs in our mind and stirs in our mind and stirs in our mind. We go to bed thinking about it. We come to church thinking about it. We avoid that person at church thinking about it. We make sure that we stay on the opposite side, and it's not anything major they've done to me. He says it starts in your own members. It's something that just starts eating away at your mind, to the point that it influences your relationship. Their expectations of others were not met. And their expectations were based upon their desires. I wanted this. I felt this. And their desires are not met. And because their desires are not met, I did not get what I want, or it didn't happen the way I think it should have happened, they are frustrated and critical of those who did not meet their expectation. But it all starts right here. There's a way I think it should have been done, my desire. The expectation was not met, therefore my response is critical, upset, frustrated, and now it has impacted my relationship with that person. This is the picture that he's painting here. There's fightings and wars among you. Where do you think it comes from? He says it comes from within your own expectations. I'm going to give a few examples here that I've created some. I've tried to think of names. Is there anybody here named Susan? No? Okay, good. Mrs. Susan expected that she would sing a special during revival. I mean, she just expected it. But Mr. Song Director, I thought I'd be safe with that one. Mr. Song Director didn't ask Miss Susan to sing during revival because he had already asked other people. I think now we can see a practical application of these verses. There was a desire, an unmet expectation, and now guess who Miss Susan is upset with? Mr. Song Leader. Why? Because her desire and the expectations of her desire did not come to fruition. Therefore, instead of, and I'm going to get to this, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, instead of enjoying all the other special music, they don't enjoy any of it because it should be her. Everybody with me on this? So Mrs. Susan here, Mr. Song Leader didn't do anything wrong. It's not a sin to not ask Miss Susan to sing. It's not breaking God's word. It's not contradicting the Bible to not ask Miss Susan to sing. Mr. Song Leader didn't sin. He didn't disobey God by not asking. He simply didn't meet Miss Susan's expectation. And now we have a hindered relationship. So now they have a hindered relationship among themselves because of unmet expectations of personal desire. And that is exactly what he is saying when he says, come they not hence of your lust that war in your own members. Is this fighting not a product of you not getting what you want? I find it wonderful that James and really all of Scripture have a way of saying the most demeaning things in really an elegant way. I mean, we would say as parents, are you really going to act like this just because you didn't get your way? But look how elegant James is in these two verses. From whence come wars, and I feel like I'm going to talk to my children that way from now on. From whence come these fightings among you children? We'll see how they respond. As a dad, I get looks from my children quite often. I feel like that makes me feel like I'm doing a good job as a dad. After seeing their relationships, we then notice in verse 2 their method. So how do we respond when expectations are not met? How do we respond if we feel like somebody should have done this but they did that? How do we respond if somebody said this when we don't think they should have said anything? How do we respond how should Miss Susan respond when she doesn't get to sing during revival? What is the response to this? We notice their method here in verse number 2. He says, ye lust and have not. Here's the question, if people are not meeting your expectation, how much of that are you willing to take in your own hands? Fine, I'll just take matters in my own hands. I was at a church one time and there was a lady whose name was not Susan, all names have been changed, who truly wanted to sing at a meeting. Schedule was full, didn't work. And so during testimony times, this lady stands up in front of everybody and says, I just really feel a song on my heart. Can I come sing a song? Now, she'd already been told no privately. And now she has put everybody in a difficult situation. Now, unfortunately for her, my dad was the pastor who had no problem just saying, no, I think we've got music covered. And now she felt quite awkward, but how many would agree she put herself in the situation? So the question is, when we are in that situation, how much do we try to take things into our own hands? I'll just take matters in my own hands. I'll just do it my own way. Because with disappointment comes discontentment. I'm not happy till it's solved. I'm disappointed, and therefore I am discontent with everything that is going on, and their life becomes miserable. I want you to notice, first of all, their mental disposition. In verse number 2, he says this, ye lust and have not. This would be, if you could summarize how the people here felt. They wanted, but they didn't get it. And let's remind ourselves, our world today has changed a lot of words. This word lust simply has to do with all desires. Just anything I want, anything I think should happen, anything I want. And this is the summary of how they were. I want, ye lust, but you have not. You want, but you're not getting it. Some of you want this, but you're not getting that. Some want that, but you're not getting it. Some people want this person in charge, but they're not getting it. Some person want this person to handle something, but they're not getting it. Everybody has all these things within this congregation. Everybody has all these things they want. And he says, and you're all miserable. Because some of you want so-and-so to lead the singing. Somebody else wants this guy to sing the singing, but it's actually Jack who leads the singing. And now everybody's upset. Is there any Jack here? Okay, good. Didn't want to appoint a song leader all of a sudden. We notice their mental disposition. It's the summary of their relationship with others, and it is a warring of their own members. It eats its way to bitterness and to anger. I want and I don't have. I want people to do this, and they're not doing it. I got a call one time, I hope people here would be surprised. I got a call one time from a grown woman in probably 50s, maybe 60, I don't know, because I didn't call and tell her husband happy birthday. Well, I'm sorry. I don't know what to tell you. But if it eats away at you that much that I didn't call your grown husband, so that you have to call me and tell me how you feel, I'll call him, tell him happy birthday, and it'll be late, and he won't get any satisfaction out of it. I want and I don't have. Miss Susan desired to sing, but she didn't get to sing. She didn't get what she wanted. I don't think we have any Boyd here. Mr. Boyd, he desired to be a deacon, but he didn't get to be a deacon. Mr. and Miss Williams, okay, good, I'm doing good, desired to teach a class, but they didn't get to teach a class. He's saying there are people in the congregation that you want and you're not getting what you want. Well, let's face reality. How in the world can everybody in one congregation, everybody get what they want? So this is not even a realistic possibility, but yet it eats away at people's minds because they are so persuaded that their way is right. And we're going to find there's a lot of pride that's involved with this. Their way is right and their thinking is right, and people ought to listen to them and people ought to choose them. Mrs. Mom doesn't want to be scheduled in the nursery, but Mrs. Mom is scheduled in the nursery. I am not getting what I want. James lets us know that this mental disposition leads to discontented efforts. Verse number 2, look what he goes on. He states, ye lust and have not, and then he goes on and says, ye kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. Now, in case you're wondering, they were not literally killing. This is a metaphor for exactly what he says next. He says, ye kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. Now he's going to restate it. Ye fight and war, and yet ye have not. You're fighting for this. You're fighting amongst each other. You're arguing with each other. There's discontentment with one another, and yet you're not satisfied. Well, if you look at the statement, ye kill, think about this. He says, ye kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. Can you imagine going, hunting the prey, getting the prey, but there being no meat to satisfy? He says this is exactly what it is when something stirs up and you take it in your own hands and you go tell so-and-so, or you go talk so-and-so, and you go handle this with so-and-so in an ungodly manner and with the wrong spirit, which we're going to find out is exactly what they did. When you go and handle this the way you shouldn't, you will find no satisfaction. Nothing. Like hunting prey that has no meat to satisfy. And yet how many times people, I told them, and what was accomplished? Because Miss Susan could have came and told Mr. Song Leader, but does anybody think that would have got Miss Susan a place singing? Maybe with some people, probably not around here. No. Mr. Deacon, well, I ought to be the deacon. You should have voted on me. How many people in the church would that make them want to vote on him? Of course not. So he says their method is all in this attack, and I'll tell them, Christians attack each other and find there to be no satisfaction or no contentment in the results. So what does Miss Susan do when Mr. Song Leader doesn't ask her to sing? Well, talk bad about Mr. Song Leader, of course. What else? Let's go talk bad about Mr. Song Leader. But this doesn't gain her a spot on the schedule. What does Mr. Boyd do when he doesn't get to be a deacon? We'll talk bad about the people who voted against him, of course. I mean, is this not the human nature of us? To talk bad about them. But of course, this doesn't get him a spot as a deacon. What do Mr. and Mrs. Williams do when the Sunday school teacher knew full well they wanted to teach, and they went on vacation and didn't ask Mr. and Mrs. Williams to fill in for them? Well, we'll talk bad about that Sunday school teacher. That's what we'll do. But that doesn't gain him a spot as teaching. So he says all these things you desire, and he says you kill, and of course it's not a physical death, but he says you want, you desire, and you cannot obtain. Ye fight in war, and yet you have not. And he goes on, basically he is saying this, you're fighting among yourselves, but I ask you this, what has it gotten you? Where has it gotten you? Where is the victory? Because sadly enough, you walk in a lot of churches, and victory in Jesus is the only victory they got. Because there's no victory in friendships or relationships or anything else. There ought to be a refreshing joy that comes with being around the people of God. What does Miss Mom do when she's scheduled for the nursery? Again. We'll go talk about Mrs. Nursery Scheduler. That's what. But what good does it do? Where does this get you spiritually? Where does this get you one with another? Which, by the way, the Bible principles are so amazing. They apply everywhere. You can take this and apply it to your workplace. You can apply this to your family. You can apply this to every area of life. So he says there's this disgruntled, there's this disagreement. It eats at your mind, and then it is handled the wrong way. Their method is wrong. The method of attacking does not satisfy their desires. So we notice in verse 1, their relationships, from whence come wars and fighting among you. We see their method. You lust and have not. You kill, desire to have, cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you have not. All this fighting and warring and arguing and backbiting and discontentment and the miserable state of mind, they are at the same place at the end of verse 2 as they were at the beginning of verse 2, which is exactly where this response will get you. Absolutely nowhere. But then we come to the heart of the problem in verse 3. Verse 3, we see their dependency. we notice their dependency was not on God. At the end of verse number 2, he says all these things. You cannot obtain, you fight in war, yet you have not. Why? Because ye ask not. Now, I would not disagree with the application here of this being prayer. But the whole context of these verses is relationships with other people. How do you feel about maybe Miss Susan going ahead of time and saying, I've got a great song I think would be a help. Do you mind if I sing during revival? Whoa. It's amazing what a question might do. I've had people come for years say, I really wanted to teach a class. Well, all you had to do is come and ask. Or at least let me know you wanted to. Because we bottle it up and we think people ought to know it. And then when other things happen, it eats at our mind and bothers us. And truth is, we've never put it out there. We've never asked. We've never confronted. We've never had the conversation. And so I don't want to, he certainly is going to reference the asking God, but I don't want to separate the practical application of this. Could it be that you don't have what you want with other people simply because you don't ask? There's another Bible verse we're familiar with. He that hath friends must show himself friendly. There is a Bible principle here that certainly applies. And so at the end of verse 2, he says, the reason you don't have what it is you want is because you don't ask. You're not asking them. You're not surrendering at all to them. It is all about what I want, what I think, what I feel. And we notice in this passage how dependent people can be upon themselves. God desires that we rely on Him, that we are dependent upon Him, that we trust in Him. And we notice in our text their dependence upon their own abilities, and it is displayed through their pride. They are so dependent on what I think and what I want and what I can do. He actually tells them a few times, referencing their pride. In verse number 6, he goes on and says, I'll give grace to the humble. In verse 10, he says, humble yourselves, letting us know that at the heart of this problem, of this self-dependency, is there is a pride. And if you'll humble yourselves, he actually tells him, I will lift you up. So you can fight and fight and fight to climb your own way to where you ought to be, or we can humble ourselves and let God put us where we ought to be, and God elevate us, and God bless us, and God allow us to serve Him, and God allow our relationships to strengthen. We can fight because it eats away at our mind, or we can humble ourselves and say, I'm going to love God and I'm going to love people. By the way, on these two hang all the law and the commandments. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love thy neighbor as thyself. If we can accomplish those two things, how many other things would fall into place? But instead, we see their dependency is upon their own selves. Humility asks. I do not like to ask for directions. Matter of fact, we have so many beds in our house, it's ridiculous. We have 10 people in our family right now. That's a lot. And we bought another bed yesterday. And the person we bought it from said, I have some pictures that I took while I disassembled it that I can send to you while you're putting it back together, if that will help. But oh no. 1 hour later, I was halfway done with the bed. I could have asked for pictures, but it just didn't feel like the right thing to do. You know what I mean? It just didn't feel. I put together so many beds, it's embarrassing to ask questions. But you know what humility does? Humility asks. This is why the Bible tells us when you have aught between one another, you know what he says to do? Go talk to one another. Hey, for some reason we seem to have a hindered spirit. Are we okay? You may be surprised how small of a thing may have just been eating away at the mind. You may be surprised to find out somebody was going through a rough day or a tough situation and said something they maybe shouldn't have said, and all it takes is a quick, easy conversation and it's fixed, but instead we let it just eat away at our mind, and it hinders our relationship. So how do we handle it? They were dependent on their own abilities. Miss Susan doesn't enjoy the special song anymore because she thinks she could do better. Mr. Boyd doesn't respect the deacon because it ought to be him. Mr. and Mrs. Williams, they don't encourage or compliment the teacher because they ought to be teaching. Everybody see what happens here? Dependency upon self steals appreciation for others. It steals our love for others. It steals our appreciation for others. And then we see they were dependent on their own power displayed through their methods, fighting as wars among you. You kill, you fight, you war in verse 2. He says the way you're handling it is all wrong. The way you are fighting tells me who you are counting on. Remember David when he had the stone? Does anybody remember that song in children's church? And one little stone, and the sling went round and 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 round. Anybody remember that? Okay, 3 people, good. You 3 are singing a special next week. But you know what David was doing? He said, not in my might, but in God's power. He takes that stone, he releases that stone, not relying on himself, but counting on God to handle it. And when he let God handle the situation, what great victory came. But if David would have taken Saul's armor and his sword and his shield and his helmet and went out there and tried to fight in his own power and his own might, the story of David would have ended right there. And I wonder how many Christians' stories have come to an end because they tried taking things in their own hands. Their dependency on self was revealed in their methods, their fighting. And then he says very quickly, I don't want to ignore verse 3, ye ask and receive not because ye ask amiss. That word amiss, I actually looked it up for the first time. I've always heard a definition, but I looked up the word. It literally means badly. Badly, grievously, and miserably. You ever asked a question badly? I know I have. It might sound something like this. Since I have such a great voice, can I sing during revival? That would be asking badly. That would be poorly. Since I'm probably the most spiritual man here, don't you think I should be deacon? That would be badly. Brother Petty, that's a bad question. I mean, that is a bad, you would not ask it. I don't even know why I said your name just then. But, yeah. You see, they often ask questions with the purpose of guilting. It's not even a genuine question. They ask with the purpose of convincing. They ask with a prideful spirit of expectancy. We all know those people that in asking, it sure sounds a lot like demanding. And that's what he is pointing out here, that you have not because you ask. And when you do ask, you're asking very poorly. You're not, matter of fact, the next statement he makes lets them know they're not even asking with the right attitude. He says, you ask amiss that you may consume it upon your own lust. You're even relying on yourself in the way you ask the question. I want my way, and so I'm asking you in a way that will manipulate you into doing things my way. And by the way, there are a lot of relationships ruined because people handle things this way. A lot of people, I want it my way, and so I'll ask, and I'll keep telling you how I think it ought to be done, how I think it ought to be done. And there are some people, and I've had this many times, somebody ask a question, you give an answer, but it wasn't what they wanted to hear. And so they don't come back with, okay, thank you. They come back with an argument to your answer, and they're the ones who asked you for the answer. Makes me say, did you want an answer? Or were you looking for somebody to agree with you? Because if the purpose of our question is just to get somebody to see it our way, that's not a question. He says, when you do ask, you ask amiss. Conversations are hindered. Who wants to talk with somebody who's always discontent? Who wants to call up somebody who complains the whole conversation? We still ought to love each other, but I tell you, it's a whole lot more enjoyable when it's somebody with a good spirit and good conversation and understands things aren't always going to be the way I think or the way I want or how I feel. And so we see the answer, and I just want you to glance, and we're going to close here. I want you to glance at the answer that we're going to be covering in the coming weeks. Next week we'll have family, but starting after that, here's the answer to these relationships inside the church family. Verse number 4, he says that we ought to be a friend of God. That'll help things. Verse number 5, he says, look to the scripture. That'll help things. Verse number 6, resist pride. Verse number 7, submit yourselves to God and resist the devil. Verse 8, draw nigh unto God and to seek forgiveness. Verse 9, let God change you. Verse 10, humble yourselves. He gives this list. He says, here's where the answer lies. But right now you're still stuck on what you want and you think, and it is warring in your members, and it is affecting and influencing your relationship with other people. The same people that believe that God sent his only begotten Son. The same people that sing the same songs. The same people that believe that without God there is no hope. And yet here we are with this discontentment with the church family. So I come to a close with this. How well are you getting along with other Christians? How well do you get along with other Christians? To the new Christian, let me say this. There is nothing the devil would like more than to see your relationship with your new Christian family to be hurt. There's nothing the devil would like more. He'll tell you that others are judging you. He'll tell you that others don't appreciate you. He'll tell you others aren't interested in you. You just determine, young and old Christian alike, just determine that you're going to keep trusting God and you're going to keep loving people and you're just going to let God do what God does. And when something doesn't go my way, that's okay. If something happens that I don't think should have happened, that's okay. If somebody says something I don't think they should have said, that's okay. And if it comes down to it, let's go have a conversation. But most things, we can usually just say, that's not a big deal. He says that we ought to strive not to be offended by others. That's our desire. So how well do you get along with other Christians? You say, well, I get along with most, but there's this one. Well, then let's talk about that one. Because God would like us to have a right relationship with everybody.